Good evening to all my lovely subscribers. Welcome to all the new subscribers as well, because I realised that the subscribership has gone up quite a bit recently. So, welcome to everyone. This is Usually Fixing and Tinkering, and my name is Andrew. And this is the channel that goes really deep into the nitty gritty stuff of modern classic car ownership, or maybe classic car ownership in the future, funds pending, as I always say. The subject of this slight ramble is the traditional car club dying? And that is a question that has been posed quite a few times in the last few years. Now, what I would like to do is just step back a bit and think about the history of car clubs. Now, car clubs have been around since probably the 1970s, 1980s, as long as time can pass. As soon as vintage 1920s, 1930s motors, pre-war motors, started to become quite ancient in the 60s and 70s, if they did survive at all during the World War, then there were people who were willing to restore them, preserve them, and actually start up groups of people that would help people restore their own cars or just communicate and meet up with like-minded people. But usually it started out more of the helping and finding parts, because that was a problem. In the days before mobile phones, the only way of communicating was letters, newsletters, and that was the main way of communicating with other people of a like-minded nature who enjoy the same sort of car or the same sort of brand of car. So that was really the only way people went about communicating and interacting with each other. It was a really hard, I can imagine it being a really hard time, because nowadays things have changed a lot since the advent of the internet and mobile phones. So that car scene in the 60s, 70s really expanded into the 80s, where again more cars came on the bandwagon, and then in the 90s, some post-war classic car clubs started appearing all over the place. Virtually every car having a club by the end of the late 90s. Only certain cars were missed out or just not considered worthy enough. But you can consider a lot of classic cars were still not worth very much back in the day. So it was very much of a pure enthusiast nature, where the cars weren't worth much. Nobody really thought about them as, classic cars being a thing. It was always there's an element of a middle-aged or old man mucking around in his garage with an old car that nobody cares about. And it was kind of that sort of hobby for many years until probably the late noughties, where it became a little bit more fashionable and a little bit more presented in the world of the social media platforms taking over and the internet. And then as you went through the noughties, obviously the internet was becoming a big thing. You could now have a club website. You could now communicate with people in a few different ways, but still mainly the way a club worked was you would have a newsletter, a bi-monthly or monthly newsletter going out to members to inform them of the current shows, any parts, jumble sales going on, anything like that. And that was still the main way of communicating. And even if you had a problem with your car, the main way of getting expert knowledge was to contact the club technical secretary, as it's such. There would be a person who would be responsible, people who would be responsible specifically for giving technical advice, such as the sort of technical advice that I give to you on this channel. If there was no car channel, this would be done through a newsletter or phone conversation. So instead of you giving me a message on a YouTube channel or giving me an email, you would basically be phoning me up, and that's the way things were. And it wasn't exactly the most. It was the only way of communicating, but it was the only open, really, way of communicating. But it was not to everyone's taste, and not everybody wants to have a phone conversation with a complete stranger. So it wasn't really. It was a very niche thing, and car clubs were very cliquey back in the day. I can imagine being a select group of maybe friends, people who've got to know each other, and it goes from there really. It wasn't really until social media starting in the late 90s, that sort of late noughties, with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, that everything slowly took off in terms of how it appealed to a wider and much younger audience. I mean, suddenly now car clubs didn't just have a website and a bi-monthly newsletter. You can contact people via social media, a complete stranger, just by texting or putting some pictures, maybe a bit of diagnosis. Oh, I've got this problem. I've got this problem X, Y, and Z. Here's a picture. People can see it on a club, a group page, and many people can respond likewise with various different opinions. Obviously, there is a drawback to that. There could be some really poor opinions and people giving misdirections, but that's the idea of experience. You trying to collate what you think might be relevant to your problem and what might not be relevant to your problem. It is that little thing we've had to go through, and the car forums went up as well. Car forums were a thing just before social media kicked off. Car forums were around from the time the internet started in the sort of early noughties. Some of the forums crept up. There's lots of Rover forums, the Ford Focus owners forum, Ford owners forums. They all started in the early noughties. And you can see some posts dating back to when the Focus Mark 1 was still in production, 2001, 2002. Some posts were going on back then, and people were having problems, teething problems back then, as you can imagine with any car that was relatively new. And that's really where it went. So you have all these ways of communicating with people, and suddenly people are just posting meetups and places to go on Facebook and social media, and it's just imploded. The last 5-6 years, it's imploded even more with social media. I mean, you've got things like TikTok, which I'm really not interested in, but there's quite a few ways of getting across to your audience. And then the YouTubing started. I mean, YouTubing wasn't really a thing until about 2019, and then COVID came around, and then it just boomed because people were in front of their screens at home. They were basically off work, and basically they had a lot of spare time to do things, and watching YouTube videos was certainly one. And then a few people started cottoning on to this, and hence why we've had a bit of a boom of YouTubing. And YouTubing for me is the ultimate form of communication. It is a way of verbally communicating through a video, and people can interact in the video like a normal forum. A normal car forum just has messages one after the other. Well, this is the same. It just depends how many people put comments at the end of my videos, and then we can go from there. You can do live streams now, which is more of a thing. Something that I was not unbelievably enthusiastic about, but now I've got into it and I do it once every so often. It's quite good, and it's a great way of interacting with people. And car clubs now use this way, and most car clubs though are still running two sets of members. They've got the older members, and then they've got the younger members to cater for, because car clubs cannot exist without younger, newer members coming into the scene. So they've had to adapt what they've done massively. Some clubs haven't, and that's going to be their downfall going forwards, and we'll cover that in a second. But most will have still a bi-monthly or monthly newsletter going out to every one of the members, because it's a paid for membership. And then you have the social media platforms which they've set up, maybe a specific forum, links to their websites, and all sorts of ways of getting in contact without picking up the phone. The days where you had to pick up the phone to somebody are long gone. They were gone about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. That's it. Social media has basically ensured that you can communicate with somebody at the click of a message, and it's as simple as that. So all the advantages are there, but where does that lead us with car clubs in general, the traditional car club? And what I mean by a traditional car club is paying a membership, being a member of a car club. You pay a membership fee of something like £25, £30 for a year's membership, which will cover several costs through the club, because most clubs are registered charities in their own right these days. Some are not. Some are purely not charities, but obviously with when you're handling money, there's a lot of other aspects to consider. But that the traditional club where someone pays to be a member, is that dying? Yes, it is. For most people under the age of 40, around my age, I never considered a membership. I was a member of the Rover P6 owners, not the owners club. It was the Rover P6 club, formerly known as the Rover P6 Drivers Club. I joined in after I bought the P6 in 2014. Because I was told that would be the right thing to do, to join a club, because you do need expert help, and I didn't know any better. And to be fair, I could have done with the experience and advice back there, and knowledge to where I get parts from. Turns out parts for P6s are not an issue in many cases. Some cases, yes, but mostly their parts availability is actually really, really good. They can be on the steep side, especially if you have to go to J.R. Wadham's in Stourbridge, just as a shout out. Believe you me, some of their prices are just ridiculous. And some of the rubber products are awful. And rubber products, ball joints, covers, dust covers, you name it, classic cars are going to suffer with really bad issues in the future, because the rubber products are nowhere near as good as the genuine stuff. And the genuine stuff is almost exhausted and will be exhausted in 10 years' time for a lot of classic British cars from the 60s, 80s, 90s. It is the way it is. So I was a fully paid up member for 12 months, and I think realistically, I was, I mean, admittedly here, I mean, I don't know who my audience might be, who might be watching this, but I was an editor for their newsletter. I was invited by the club secretary at the time because of a lot of the posts. I actually did quite a few posts on Facebook during my early P6 days, and some of my posts had caught the attention of the club secretary, who came to me and said, look, would you like to be our newspaper editor, the newsletter editor? Basically, we have a bi-monthly newsletter that goes out every couple of weeks. Would you like to basically write some articles and get some infos? We'll do a lot of the legwork. You just need to type it up, put lots of pictures in, and do a lot of editing. And back in them days, I didn't have a great access to my computer was rubbish, but I did as much editing and I did as well as I could for a couple of months. But unfortunately, I had to give it up after a few months, because the amount of work that I was being asked to do was quite a lot. And I have to give credit to people who are in a car club and working tirelessly for nothing to provide newsletters for their members. I think it's a fantastic thing what they do, to basically include members and give members basically some of what they've paid for absolutely nothing. And loads of time is dedicated by amazing people who have helped to keep so many cars on the roads. But I gave it up because, quite frankly, my full-time job at where I am now, I had to take on a lot more work there, so I just didn't have the time to do it. It was a shame, but I had to give it up. But apart from that, I don't specifically feel that I got anything more from a club membership than I did when I wasn't a member. And I let my membership basically run out, and I didn't renew it. Most of what I actually managed to, most of the help I got was through the Facebook group. The club had a Facebook page, and that's where I got all my help. And I thought, well, if I've joined a club, because what was I looking to get out of it? Help and experience and advice. Well, that's what I was getting off Facebook. So why would I need to be a member of this car club? So it dawned upon me that I didn't need to be a paid up member. And since then, I had the car for another 5 years. I was not a member for the rest of my time in P6 ownership. I got to know several club members, but I never rejoined again, because, quite frankly, I just didn't see the necessity. And I would still say that is true to this day. Most car clubs do not run on a membership-based scheme now. Most car clubs are forum and Facebook and social media-based Facebook groups. Facebook is the base for most car groups. The Ford Focus Mark 1 Facebook pages, there's a couple of them, and they do pretty well. They don't ask for membership fees and all that. Obviously, there's forums where you do pay something and you get access to some technical forums and that sort of thing. But that's really it, and you don't need that because you've got me mostly. Trust me, it's free. It's totally free to watch all this, and that's the basis on which I started the channel. Really, I wanted something a little bit different, and YouTubing was a thing, and I've been thinking about jumping on the bandwagon for ages, and I just needed a push, and a couple of people gave me the push. I went to the NEC Classic Restoration Show 3 days before my first video, and I thought, you know what, it's such a big world. I feel like a pebble on a beach compared with the size of the classic car movement. It's just grown, and the thing is, the classic car movement wouldn't be this big if it wasn't for social media and the way that's grown. And now got Instagram, and everyone's interacting on all these forums, and it's absolutely amazing. I'm on all these forums. I'm slowly starting to use Twitter more in reference to my actual channel and Instagram, and I have a Facebook group, so there are several ways of contacting me. But the question to this whole stream is the traditional car club dying? I think it is, because I think paid memberships and the traditional car club is something I associate with the, I have to mince my words here, the older generation. And I say the older generation who've been into their classics for 20, 30 years plus and have driven all these amazing cars. The younger generation, I say under 40, let's say, they are not very keen on any sort of membership model of a car club. We don't need it. We honestly don't need it. But however, there are a couple of conditions in which I think a membership would be very ideal. Number one, if you got a particularly rare vintage classic car, so we're looking at pre-60s, where parts are really hard to get, or it could be after 60s, depending on the make and model. There's a couple of examples, but if you've got a particularly rare car where getting parts is so difficult and time consuming, and potentially if you drove the car, have an accident or something breaks, the car could be off the road for a long time before you get another part. So that's where being a member of a car club and maybe getting access to the right sort of people who can get you the right sort of part, that's the best thing in the world. So a car membership is actually crucial, and it really does help the survival of cars that, quite frankly, are quite rare, and you can probably count them on your fingers. I mean, the car club will probably be fractionally small, but it makes all the difference in the world. I'll give you an example, but actually way post 1960s. The Austin Princess Ambassador Owners Club. Austin Ambassadors. They were quite. I mean, they weren't made in huge numbers because it was more of a stopgap before the Montego came out. They got the Ambassador right. They gave it an actual hatchback, like they should have done to the Princess. And I've got a real soft spot for both cars. My granddad had both, and the Ambassador had the most comfortable seats you could ever imagine. They really are comfortable seats. The rest of the car isn't particularly good. But honestly, they're now down to a penny number, and it's got to a stage where if you own an Ambassador, you should be the member of the club, because getting parts are like almost impossible now. The parts are shared with some BL models, but some are not. Some are completely unique, and the only way the club can actually get parts now is if by some miracle a barn find Ambassador comes out of the woodwork and it is just too far gone to be restored. So they will take every single last nut and bolt off and put it into storage. And I'm sure the club, some of the members have got storage lockups with Ambassador parts just stashed, because when they're gone, they are gone. It is that serious for the survival of those cars. And there is probably less than 50 of them, as far as I'm aware, on the roads, and they're just non-existent now, which is such a shame. You only see them at shows, and hopefully, I'll be seeing a couple this summer maybe. But yeah, apart from that, I would not really think that being in a car club is necessary. So the traditional car club will slowly not die out, but it will change. It will change to a non-membership car club model based off social media, a free to join, free advice, free access, just to enjoy these cars and just share knowledge. Knowledge is everything. It is the most powerful tool to keeping modern classic cars, vintage cars on the road, racing cars, whatever it is knowledge. And when people don't have knowledge and know-how, it can be a pretty intimidating world, and a world where things can spiral out of control a little bit and leave someone quite disheartened about the ownership of an older car and maybe never return to owning one. So, and we don't want that, do we? So in hindsight, it will just change, and it has been changing for a long time. My whole premise of this side of the channel, the Ford Focus side of Usually Fixing and Tinkering, because my channel is basically split. Usually Fixing and Tinkering is always going to tinkering. This channel is always going to be about Fords and Rovers because that is my interest. That is my interest. I don't have a massive interest in cars outside of that. Saabs and a few other different cars, but mainly Fords and Rovers. Those are my audiences. Those are my two audiences. Probably 75% in favour of Ford Focus audience, I gather that. But nevertheless, I love Rovers and I love Fords. I have a special place for Rover though. But overall, with the Ford Focus side of things, my plan, after meeting several different people and quite a few enthusiasts at my road trip to shows this year with the Ford Focus Mark 1 hopefully, I will get to meet people and get a gist of whether it is feasible to start a pop-up club. Now, when I say a pop-up club, it's not going to be a permanent existing club. Well, that's not my intention. It'll be a pop-up club for Ford Focus Mark 1 enthusiasts that want to keep them on the road and basically use them and enjoy them. It will be a Ford Focus Mark 1 preservation group, but nevertheless, it will be a pop-up group. So a temporary group. It will be a group that will basically allow people to become aware of the model, to grow and spread awareness that the Mark 1 Focus is now an establishing modern classic in its own right, and it is a car to grab before they become very expensive, very rare, like every other Ford before them. And most people who've got their brain cued in, they've already got one. If you're thinking about getting one, I would seriously suggest getting one. If you just tuned into this show because you're just generically interested in Fords or maybe Rovers, if you have any slight interest in Ford, I would grab a Mark 1, a good one with two hands. And when I say a good one, we're looking at one that just needs a few bits and pieces here and there. Some paintwork is obviously probably going to be needed. Some obviously maybe a little bit of welding, but not too much. We don't want too much rot on the sills and the wheel arches because then the cost can mount up, and there are much better examples. So you're looking for one of them really, with a running engine and gearbox and minimal problems. That most problems can be sorted on these cars. It is not a big deal. So this is where I'm going to leave this live stream. This is where I see what I mean. This is unscripted. It is full of stammering and me mincing my words like I usually do, if you haven't noticed that. I'm not the best person when I'm talking to the camera. I have to script myself sometimes when I'm actually doing a video because I can mince my words so badly. You do not want to know some of the retakes that I've done. Quite frankly, it's embarrassing, but I have saved some of them for a very funny episode in the future. Anyway, you take care, guys. I will see you very soon. Thank you so much for joining and watching this episode of me rambling on as usual. Till the next time, take care.